Hello, everybody. My name is Damon Beres. I am the editor-in-chief of the OneZero team at Medium. We publish stories about technology and science on three flagship editorial brands, OneZero, Debugger, and Future Human. And today, we are thrilled to welcome author and technology activist Cory Doctorow as part of our ongoing Medium in Conversation series. Cory, thank you so much for being here with us today. How's it going?
It's going very well. Thank you very much. I have a keyboard so clacky, I have two mute buttons for it. So I sometimes forget.
Good. Yes, I respect that. A good mechanical keyboard with a good amount of travel, the best, right?
The one Cherry MX switches all the way.
Yes, excellent. So before we jump in here, I want to let the audience know there is going to be a Q&A portion for audience participation towards the end of our talk. There is a little module in Zoom that you can submit your questions through. We have someone digging through them, and towards the end of our conversation, we'll be getting into some of those. So as we go on, feel free to drop things in there and we'll pick them up and hopefully get them answered later on. So to start off with, last summer, we published a book online that Cory wrote called How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism. One of the senior editors on the Medium team, Brian Merchant, worked with Cory on this book and did a fantastic job. The book is brilliant. I hope as many of you as possible have read it. It is now available in this really handsome print edition that you can find online wherever books are sold. And one of the things that has really struck me since we published this back in August is that, if anything, it has only become more urgent, more relevant. In the past month alone, so much has happened that I think really highlights many of the concerns that the book addresses about the consolidation of power in the technology industry and the future of the open web. And those are going to be the core topics of our conversation today. There's so much to dig into, and I'm getting some feedback that perhaps our faces are being obscured. If you can hear us, that's the important thing for right now. We're going to continue, and hopefully, if there's any technical issue with the visuals, we'll have that sorted out momentarily. In the meantime, power and tech, the open web, surveillance capitalism, monopoly power, these are our conversation topics today. I would love to open this conversation with Cory reading an excerpt from the book. It is from a section called An Ecology Moment for Trust Busting, and I think it sets the stage very well for our conversation. So Cory, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Damon, you chose this reading, and it's pretty much the thing I say to myself at night when I can't fall asleep because I'm worried. So it was an excellent choice.
Good.
If we're going to break up big tech's death, I beg your pardon. If we're going to break big tech's death grip on our digital lives, we're going to have to fight monopolies. That may sound pretty mundane and old-fashioned, something out of the New Deal era, while ending the use of automated behavioral modification feels like the plotline of a really cool cyberpunk novel. Meanwhile, breaking up monopolies is something we seem to have forgotten how to do. There is a bipartisan transatlantic consensus that breaking up companies is a fool's errand at best, liable to mire your federal prosecutors in decades of litigation, and counterproductive at worst, eroding the consumer benefits of large companies with massive efficiencies of scale. But trustbusters once strode the nation, brandishing law books, terrorizing robber barons, and shattering the illusion of monopoly's all-powerful grip on our society. The trust-busting era could not begin until we found the political will, until the people convinced politicians that they'd have their backs when they went up against the richest, most powerful men in the world. Can we find that political will again?
Well, Cory, I think you probably know what my first question is going to be. It's a new day in America. How are things looking?
Mixed. The outlook is mixed, Damon.
All right, tell us.
There's a Facebook lawyer tapped to run the DOJ antitrust division. that's probably bad, although not always. You may remember when John Oliver got exercised about Tom Wheeler, who was Obama's FCC chairman, who was former cable lobbyist, and Oliver called him the dingo babysitter. And actually, Tom Wheeler turned out to be a radical who was like, who knew exactly how horrible his former employers were. And so sometimes, you get these insiders who know where the bodies are buried. But I think that all the other things being equal, there are a lot of people who could have been the top trust buster at the DOJ, and an ex-Facebook lawyer was not on anyone's list. On the other hand, there's political will, and there's political will across the aisle, and there's political will across the ocean, as I said in that article. The European Union is envisioning a whole suite of anti-monopoly measures, including a bunch that are not about just like fines or money damages, but that are about market restructuring that would both break up monopolies and potentially keep them from reforming or turning into kind of regional monopolies, the way that the Baby Bells did after the AT&T breakup. And in the US, you have the attorneys general and the DOJ all gunning for most of the major tech companies. Apple is so far the exception, and they're a funny case, but I think they deserve it just as much as anyone else. And all of those things together, plus the fact that there is anti-monopoly energy in other sectors. Like, I think a lot of people woke up one day and said, what do you mean we can't distribute vaccines because America only has one company that makes glass bottles? And said, hey, maybe we've got a monopoly problem in general. And that cuts towards a reform of our view about when monopolies are problems. For 40 years, the monopolies have been problems only if you can show they were raising prices, and not if you could show that they were making people miserable in other ways. And so maybe, we're gonna move away from this highly specialized view of monopolies where you could only argue about a monopoly if you're an economist who could make or critique a model,
Right.
and into a more political conception of monopolies. And
Right.
if that happens, then I think we could see real action. I mean, I don't think that there is any administration, including the great trust busting administrations, the Roosevelts, Wilson, and so on. I don't think any of them showed up to break monopolies. I think all of them were cornered into it by constituents.
So this is really interesting. There's quite a lot to unpack here. I would imagine in this audience, there are people with varying levels of understanding about the extent to which we consider these massive tech corporations monopolies, probably varying levels of agreement about whether they really are monopolies. Tell us a little bit more about your viewpoint on that point specifically.
Sure. On what is a monopoly? So, there's this like super simplistic way of talking about a monopoly, which is a monopoly is a market with one seller. And that's like, if you are the kind of person who learns about political concepts by looking up etymology, that's as far as you'd get. But the history of monopoly enforcement turns on something called market power. And market power, in its most kind of wonkish way, is the ability to set prices, the ability to just tell people what a service costs and still have people line up to pay for it, even if you're charging too much, even if they feel like they're getting ripped off, they still pay for it. Think about both Apple and Android taking a 30% skim off of all app sales, and there not being any competition for that. And despite the fact that there are lots of people who say that it's unfair on the buy side, on the sell side, they are still able to just define a price. And that, I think, is like the best way of thinking about a monopoly. It's not about your market share. It's about whether or not you are in a market, whether or not you respond to market conditions when you set your prices.
Okay. So that makes a lot of sense in the context of a business such as Apple or Android, because there are products moving, digital products, but of course there is an app store, etc. What about something like Facebook?
So Facebook, I think that it is a monopoly in the sense that it rigs prices for its ad platform. But what Facebook is, in addition to being a monopolist, is a monopsonist, in the sense that so a monopsony is when there's only one seller. And again, it doesn't really mean there's only one seller. It means that there's a seller who can set prices the same way a monopolist is or rather there's only one buyer, I beg your pardon, in the same way that a monopolist is a seller who can set prices. And so, all the people who supply Facebook on the back end, people who make their apps, people who make services that feed into it, all of those entities are kind of stuck in terms of what they pay and what they have to give up. Media organizations that integrate Facebook get take it or leave it offers and feel that they can't walk away from it. So, in that sense, there's a monopsony. The other thing that's going on with Facebook and Google and Apple is anti-competitive conduct. And so anti-competitive conduct, you don't have to be a monopolist to be engaged in anti-competitive conduct. You just have to be doing shady stuff that exists to reduce choice in the market. So think about Mark Zuckerberg explicitly saying we need to buy Instagram because people leave Facebook to go to Instagram.
Yeah.
Right? I don't want people to have the choice of leaving Facebook. I want it so that when people leave Facebook, they land on Instagram, right? Or think about Apple lobbying 20 state houses to overturn pending right to repair legislation or blocked right to repair legislation, so that if you want to get your device fixed, you can only take it to Apple. And not only can they charge you a very high premium for the service, but much more importantly, they can tell you when your device is beyond repair. And the right after that all happened in 2018, and in his first investor letter of 2019, Tim Cook said, the biggest threat to our bottom line here is that our users aren't throwing away their phones fast enough. They're getting them fixed.
Right.
And the year before, he had spent lavishly to shut down 20 right to repair bills that would have let people fix their phones. And now he had accrued to himself the monopoly over when a phone had to be fixed and when it had to be thrown away. Or you can think about Google, which is a company that people often say grew because of network effects, but whose actual growth is entirely acquisition driven. Google has made 1.5 successful products. They made a really good search tool and a pretty good Hotmail clone. Everything else they made in-house failed. And
you didn't like Google Wave?
Well, I mean, it failed in the there's actually a bunch of products they made in-house that I thought were great, like Reader, but they failed in the sense that Google shut them down.
Yes.
Right. Or the successful products are the ones that they bought from someone else. So this is a company whose access to the capital markets is its determinant of its success, not the fact that it makes products that delight people, not that it has network effects that are, driven by its data. The idea that having 15-year-old click data is a kind of impenetrable wall around your business is bizarre. Like, what is it going to do? Help you? If you sit on it for just 10 more years, you can take all the people who searched for a roof 15 years ago and sell them a new roof. Like, it's, 6-month-old market data is super useful, maybe 1 or 2 years, but
Right.
even 15-year-old birth announcements, if you start sending people like, hey, your kid needs a college savings plan now that they're in high school now, you're going to get a significant fraction of people whose kids are dead. Like you just can't rely on that old click data for much, except for rattling around and scaring potential competitors with by saying, well, where will you get 15-year-old click data from, and
Right.
how will you compete with us?
Right. And right. So there's this very interesting notion in all of that these companies have been around long enough. They were successful enough. They're just so entrenched now in the fabric of how we conduct our lives digitally, essentially. And I want to talk more about that, but I very quickly want to pivot slightly because there's this related thing that, this makes me think about what happened earlier this month. So we're talking now about how online platforms are entrenched in our lives, about how they have so much influence over how we communicate, the products we buy, et cetera, et cetera. Earlier this month, there is major deplatforming. Donald Trump removed from Twitter, Facebook. The perhaps more interesting one in a certain respect is Parler, or Parlay, if you please, was removed from Amazon Web Services, which is, of course, a part of Amazon that controls cloud services for something like 40% of the web. So we have reached a point where I think we understand that because these companies are so gigantic. And because they are able to set terms in this way, we start to see the impact of how there are actually the impact of there being perhaps too few of these companies with this much power. I'm very curious to get your response to these deplatformings that happened this month and whether this ties into your overall notion of this monopoly power.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of us were relieved that they used their power this way. But I think a lot of us, when we then took a step back, were a little alarmed. Um, the tech companies have a problem, which is that the people who run them are not capable of being the kind of discourse czars for 300 million people in the case of Jack Dorsey, or 2.6 billion people in the case of Mark Zuckerberg. But there's another problem, which is separate but related, which is that no one is qualified to have that job.
Right.
And historically, they have made a lot of judgment calls that I think a lot of us have been angry about. I don't think there's anyone who's been happy about all of their judgment calls. And I think most people, irrespective of their political position, nurse serious grievances about at least some of those judgment calls, like who they left up and who they took down and why. And, it may be that if you make enough noise, you can ask the king to be a wise and benevolent king. But there is an alternative to having a king, which is to have a lot of different places that you can go where the leaders are responsive to you, and to have a kind of pluralistic future internet. Tom Eastman is a software developer in New Zealand, has this quote that I quote all the time, which is, "I can remember a time when the internet wasn't 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4." And I think that dreaming of a world in which Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey are, take decisions that more closely match our preferences, to say nothing of Jeff Bezos, is to dream very small, and also to dream very very irresponsibly, or very improbably, right? Like it's so unlikely that they are going to suddenly become much wiser in their old age. And instead, I think that we should aspire to a world in which the mistakes of Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, Jeff Bezos, and other kind of god emperors of the internet just are less consequential, right? Like, we should ask them to get it right, but when they get it wrong, we should be able to go, right? We should have other places that we can be. And, there are some very traditional tools for fighting monopolies, right? That historically we used on banks and railroads and oil companies, where you say things like, well, you have to break up, you can't create vertical monopolies, you have to have structural separation, where if you operate a market, you can't also be a participant in the market. So like, rail companies were banned from owning freight companies that competed with their own customers, the way we might ban Google and Apple from making apps that compete with the apps that they sell in their app stores, or Amazon from making products that compete with the products that they sell in their online store, or the products that they host in their digital clouds. But there is another remedy for technology that is distinct to technology. And I am a technology exceptionalist in this one very narrow sense. Like, I'm not an exceptionalist in the sense that I think that it's exceptionally wicked, or that they're exceptionally smart. I think tech is run by like mediocre sociopaths, just like every other industry.
Great. Yeah.
But the thing that is distinctive about tech and unique about tech is that computers are general purpose. They had this like underlying quality that all computers can run all programs. And the network is the general purpose network. It was designed not to be optimized for any protocol. And historically, what that's meant is that in technology landscapes where you have a dominant actor who starts to do things once they've got their audience locked in, once they've got their customers locked in, that are detrimental to the audience, someone comes along and makes a compatible product, an interoperable product that allows those customers to continue to enjoy the benefits of what the dominant firm was offering, but without having to sacrifice the downsides that are being demanded of them. So you could buy the cheap printer that they were selling with the expectation of gouging you on the ink,
Right.
and then you could buy the cheap ink from a third party. And this is something that all of the dominant tech actors have relied on in the past. Facebook got to be Facebook not by convincing everyone that they like Facebook better than they like their friends. So they should all just leave and go to MySpace and wait for their friends to, or leave MySpace and go to Facebook, wait for their friends to get there. They just made a tool where you could leave MySpace, go to Facebook, and then tell it what your MySpace login and password was, and it would just
Right.
go back to MySpace and
Take
get
all
your
the
waiting
data.
messages and send them back to you. And that meant that you could kind of ease your way from MySpace to Facebook. You didn't have to wait for all your friends to come. You didn't have to have National Leave MySpace Day. You could just be on Facebook, still see your friends. And what Facebook has since done is sued everyone who's ever tried to do that for people who want to leave Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
And so establishing interoperability, both through mandates, which we've seen introduced in both the US Congress and the European Union, and also through reforms to law, so that the legal tools that they use to block interoperators are whittled away, so that they don't get to decide who can compete with them and how,
Right.
would allow you to keep your iPhone but change app stores, or
Mm-hmm.
keep your Facebook friends but not be spied on by Facebook, or use Google search but not have the Google surveillance as part of it, to really leverage their walled gardens and turn them into feedlots that competitors could show up to and just sort of gobble up all the customers who are stuck there and don't like it.
Sure. Great. That sounds wonderful. So what we're getting at here, and what you do talk about in the book quite a bit, is this notion of a more open web. That interoperability is such an important concept there. Being able to break out of these walled gardens, essentially. I have to ask you though. I am curious about to what extent that is a realistic aspiration anymore. Not necessarily in the sense of it seeming impossible for there to be some kind of antitrust action or whatever in the United States. Certainly is possible. But listen, we have this month, Uganda blocked Facebook services. You have the Great Firewall in China. And then, of course, yes, you do continue to have this the incredibly powerful services like Amazon that have this massive cloud platform, et cetera, et cetera. Are we too far gone to have a true global open web? Is this a realistic goal? What is the material aspiration that you have here?
Yeah, I mean, well, you're asking if something is possible. My day job is writing science fiction novels, so I'm
Well,
pretty good. I have
so
a
you're
pretty
perfect
broad
at thinking about
definition of
this.
possible.
Yeah.
But what I'll say is that although these forces seem intractable, and although the time during which they've dominated seems eternal, they are relatively new. They have some really important weaknesses. Among them, the fact that technologists who work for them are in scarce supply. And that this is not forgive me for talking about a different book that I wrote on this, but my last
Please.
novel,
Yeah.
Attack Surface, is about technologists having moral reckonings. And the journey of a technologist starts with the incredible power and self-determination that comes from building technology, right? Like the first time you write successful code, you have expressed your will with sufficient precision and crispness that the computer will then enact your will infinitely at effectively no cost. And then when you connect that code to a network, you can project your will around the world. You can take the choresome thing that you have turned into an automated process that happens at the click of a mouse, and you can make it disappear for an infinite number of people for no cost just by making your code available.
Hmm.
And then the communities that you discover when you do that, those communities know the words for the things you felt all your life that you've never been able to put words to. They can help you find out who your true self is, and you can with them form communities and take action together. I mean, we're looking at the GameStop bull run this week, but but it could also be Black Lives Matter, and it could also be Civil War cosplayers marching through the streets of Charlottesville with tiki torches, right? These are all expressions of it. It's not an unalloyed good, but the point is that the one thing that every technologist shares in their kind of origin story, the radioactive spider they were bitten by, is the power of technology to give them the ability to control their lives in important ways. And now they labor with every hour that God sends to make sure no one else will have that experience, right? And you see 20,000 Googlers walking out over harmful product designs and toxic work environment. You see Amazon tech workers making solidarity with Amazon warehouse workers and connecting their work to climate change and to other social harms. You know, there is a burgeoning consciousness there that links up with a burgeoning consciousness in other domains. Because I think you're right. If this were about just changing our relationship to technology, it would be a hard lift. But there is a wave sweeping the world right now of anger about monopolies in every domain, right?
Mm.
There is a whole subculture of people who are absolutely white hot furious about the fact that wrestling is down to one league and
Yeah.
its owner, Vince McMahon, a billionaire Trump supporter, reclassified all his employees, misclassified them as contractors so he could strip them of health care. And they're all dying in their 50s of work-related injuries and begging on GoFundMe for pennies so they can die with dignity. Those people don't know it, but they're allied with the anti-monopoly movement, right? If you're angry that your favorite wrestler is dying of brain injuries sustained through multiple concussions, then you are angry about monopolies and you're angry about Facebook. And, you know, there was a
Mm.
time when some people cared about owls and other people cared about the ozone layer. And they didn't really understand that they were fighting the same fight. They may have
Mm.
understood that both of those were worthy causes, but they didn't know the word ecology. The word ecology came into common parlance in the 70s. And before that, you had 1,000 issues and no movement. And the term ecology turned all of those issues into one movement with 1,000 ways to get involved.
Mm.
And I think that we do have the possibility of creating this global movement of people who want power devolved to communities and to individuals so that we can make our own calls, so that we can address climate change, so that we can address our urban problems, so that we can address pharmaceutical monopolies, so that we can address the fact that there's 4 giant accounting firms that control all of the audits of all the major companies. And, you know, these people have pissed off the wrong people because they've pissed off rich investors because they falsify the books of giant companies whom they perform consulting services for, so that nobody knows, none of their investors know that they're on the brink of bankruptcy because they've been hollowed out by excessive executive compensation and fool's errand, vanity projects, and nobody finds out until they collapse, like Carillion did, stranding, you know, all of those contracts, all of that stuff. And then these big 4 accounting firms, they get the job of unwinding the companies and overseeing their bankruptcy. After helping them lie their way into bankruptcy, the only companies big enough and with the appropriate skills to help them maneuver navigate the bankruptcy are the same companies. Those people, the people who lose their shirts on Carillion, they're pissed off too about monopolies. No one came down off a mountain with 2 stone tablets and said, you know, Sergey, Larry, stop rotating your log files and mine them for actionable market intelligence, right? There's nothing that says that you can't run Google without an ad tech stack. There's nothing that says that Facebook has to buy all of its competitors in order to perform the value that it gives to the people who get value out of it. All of those things are choices made by people, and all of those choices can be unwound. And we've done it before, and we've done it with monopolists who are much better situated. You know, Andrew Mellon was like one of history's great monsters. He was the man who owned all the aluminum in the world. He was the Secretary of the Treasury. During the war, he denied the American aerospace industry aluminum to build planes with because he wanted to keep the price high while he was the Secretary of the Treasury, right? And his own hand-picked board ousted him. So, you know, the bigger they are, the harder they fall.
Yep. Very interesting.
His grandson is still a multi-millionaire
Right.
who backs
Doing okay.
Republican causes and was a major Trump donor.
Sure, of course. I want to loop back to something you said earlier. And also, I want to remind the audience in about 10 minutes now, we'll take some of your questions. So feel free to go ahead and use that Zoom Q&A function, and we'll be gathering those up and answering some of those in about 10 minutes. Cory, so this is all very interesting. Something I think about quite a bit in regards to this conversation is whether or not part of what we're stumbling on is this notion that these tech platforms, these tech products they seem novel to people, which is to say, the conception of Facebook as having this kind of consolidated power, or even Apple, is very different than understanding an aluminum monopoly or a railroad monopoly, a commodity, right? You said, when I asked the first question, you were talking about how this former Facebook lawyer has been tapped for the DOJ. And I think it's very interesting because I think part of what we have historically struggled with in regards to this conversation is that we simply do not have all that many people in power in political power in this country who understand all that much about how any of this works, how any of these companies work, how any of the technology works, or even how to look at the impacts 5 years into the future. I'm curious to hear your
Mm.
response to that and whether you think that's valid, whether you think that this notion of innovation is something that trips us up. Like, is part of this just kind of a divide in understanding that we need to find a way to bridge somehow?
Yeah, I've heard that, and I'm guilty as much as anyone of saying, oh, Congress is a bunch of old people who ask Mark Zuckerberg, how do you make money? Well, we sell ads, Senator.
Right.
Right? Like, we all like get giggles from that, but
Right.
you know, the world is made up of very intensely technological questions that no one in Congress is an expert on, right? Like epidemiology, right? There are no microbiologists in Congress. And, this is an example I used before the plague months, and it's even more salient now. But, you're not dead of listeria or cholera. And there's no one on your city council who you elected, chances are, who's like a microbiologist or a water scientist, right? There's no one who even understands it beyond the most cursory, like my level, right? Like there's microscopic organisms, and if you do the water purification wrong, they breed. And I don't really know maybe it involves bleach. I don't really know.
Uh-huh.
What I do know is I'm not dead of giardia, right? Or cholera, or any of the million other waterborne illnesses that have killed so many of our ancestors. The only word in Polish my grandmother taught me was cholera, which is the all-purpose Polish curse, which just means cholera, right? Like when your one major curse is just cholera, it tells you like what it means to live through cholera, right? So the the way that we get to good policy is by having um, expert regulators who act as referees, right? Who hear contradictory truth claims from partisan experts who have different reasons to believe different things about complicated technical questions. And the expert regulators are meant to recuse themselves where they have conflicts. And then they look at all of this evidence and they weigh it in the balance, and they form a conclusion from these truth claims, and they show they're working. And then they have a formal process whereby they can revisit those conclusions when new evidence comes to light or if errors in their reason are revealed. And what we've never asked lawmakers, or, for that matter, citizens to do, is have the nuanced grasp that they can understand all of those deliberations. Instead, what we've done is we've asked people to look at the shape of the deliberation, right? Is it a fair process? Does the adjudicator, are they married to someone who works for a company that is stands to benefit from a certain truth claim winning out? Are there other parts of this process that just seem wrong? Because here's the thing, right? You and I could have been dead 10 times already today from getting those technological questions wrong. Not just food safety and not just water safety, but I'm in a room with a reinforced steel joist over my head, and there's a metallurgical standard that describes the kinds of alloys and the math that the engineers have to do to build that ceiling. And the ceiling is not falling on my head today, not because I did the research and applied critical thinking, but because we have a good process, right? The anti-lock brakes on my car that I drove out to look for my mail when I went to the post box just before sitting down with you today. The distance education my daughter is doing over Google Classroom and the pedagogical methods associated with it, the Boeing 737 Maxes that land and take off at regular intervals, even now at Burbank Airport, which is just 10 minutes from my front door. Understanding whether or not any of those are safe, fit for consumption, will kill, maim, or destroy our lives is not a thing any one of us is capable of doing. I mean, even if you pick one domain, right? Become an expert and evaluate the vaccines that we're all being asked to put in our arms in the coming months. You will spend years acquiring that expertise, and you will still know nothing about aerospace or the alloys in your ceiling joists. And so you have to trust the process. And the thing is that monopolies turn truth-seeking exercises into auctions, because when you have monopolies, you have a concentrated group of industrial actors who are small enough in number that they can agree on a common position about what the truth should be. Like, aerospace companies should certify their own aviation firmware and not submit to external evaluation by the FAA, right? Which was the common position of the aerospace industry when the 737 MAX started falling out of the sky, right? And moreover, they extract monopoly rents that they can mobilize to turn that consensus into policy. And this is coming back to this book, and the book it seeks to comment on, which is Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism, and the idea that conspiratorialism is the result of big data having been turned into a kind of mind control system that was originally intended for commercial purposes, to sell your nephew fidget spinners, but was then hijacked by the Mercers to turn your uncle into a racist. And
Right.
instead, I think that a better explanation is that people stop believing in a unified truth because the mechanisms by which we arrive at the truth stop being reliable, right? That if you ask people why they don't believe in vaccines and talk to them long enough, one of them is going to mention Vioxx or OxyContin or the other ghastly failures of pharmaceutical regulation, where you really did have referees who were batting for one side, and the side they were batting for was big pharma. Big pharma made billions, generally got away scot-free, and people died in their thousands and hundreds of thousands, and globally in their millions as a result of that malfeasance. Well, against that backdrop, if you don't trust the system anymore, and you don't have the expertise to understand the question and adjudicate it yourself, you just have to find someone, someone who's like a bullshit, self-confident snake oil salesman who sounds like they know what they're talking about and can say a few things that feel true to you, and then you just throw your trust in with them. You end up mired in a cult of personality where you trust the people who sound like they know what they're talking about, and not a process that has checks and balances.
Hmm. Right. For what it's worth, the mind control worked on me, and I did buy myself a fidget spinner. So
Good for you.
I hear what you're saying, but skeptical still. Um,
I
uh,
got these little brutalist concrete houses for Christmas, and
oh,
they're my new
lovely.
fidget spinners.
From an Instagram ad, I hope.
Something like that.
So, all right, we're going to turn it over to audience questions in just a minute. Before we do that, I want just very quickly two things from you. I want to hear whether you're feeling optimistic or pessimistic about the future, since, as you've noted, you are a great sci-fi thinker. I want to hear, what do you have to say about optimism versus pessimism at this moment? And then I want to hear from you. There is so much that people can read and learn about in regards to this topic. Hopefully, they start with your book, How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism. But what other resources would you recommend to people who simply want to learn more? Can you give us those two things?
Sure. So on the first question, optimism, pessimism, I'm not a fan of either. I think they're both a form of fatalism, because if you're optimistic, you think that no matter what we do, things are going to get better. And if you're fatalistic, you think that no matter what, or if you're pessimistic, you think that no matter what happens, what we do, things are going to get worse, right? That we don't act on the world. And instead, I like to brief for hope, which is the idea that even if you can't chart a path from A to Z, from here to the world that you want to live in, that the terrain is so complicated and so much is obscured and unknowable that if you can just find one step you can take that will materially improve your conditions, that you will attain a new vantage point from which you may see new ways to get closer, to ascend the gradient towards the world that you want. If your ship sinks in the middle of the sea, you tread water not because you have a reasonable expectation of being rescued, but because treading water is the precondition for being rescued if a ship comes along, or there's a floating log to hold on to. And here we have more directions we can travel in that bring us up the gradient that towards a better world than we've had in quite some time, between vaccines and administrative competence at the highest levels, and a burgeoning consciousness about where our systemic problems are, the slow erosion of 40 years of doctrine that says that all of these problems are consumer problems, they're individual problems, that if you don't like monopoly, shop somewhere else. If you're worried about climate change, just recycle more. And instead, acknowledging that these are systemic issues that require us to work together, that as an individual, the only action that you can take that matters is joining a group,
Hmm.
so that you can be part of a systemic solution. That is a very exciting thing. Even though there's plenty of roadblocks, and even though I don't know how we get from A to Z, I think that there are still there are more and steeper ways up the hill than we've been able to see in a long time. And then the question of where to go next. I mean, I have a daily blog. I've been blogging now for just over 20 years. And for a long time, I blogged at Boing Boing. And then for just over a year, I've been at a website I started called Pluralistic, where I link to resources every day. The people I follow on this technologically, I consult with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I've been with them for 19 years. And we publish a lot of good work on this, specifically on tech and monopoly, and where the tech remedies are. My colleague, Catherine Trendacosta, just published a very good essay on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and its relationship to monopoly. And basically, all the things people say they don't like about CDA 230 are really things they don't like about monopolies. My colleague, Ernesto Falcon, has been really good in writing about monopolies and broadband, and how that has become such a salient question in so many people's lives. Uh, Lindsay Oliver has been writing about student proctoring apps, and the way that lockdown students are being exposed to horrifically abusive technology for a pedagogically bankrupt mission to spy on them while they sit useless high stakes exams, and how that's normalizing just a ghastly future for them.
Yeah.
So EFF is a great place to go. Tech Dirt, I think, has good policy, good work on this. And then literally today, just before we got on the call, I finished David Dian's last book, Monopolized.
Mm.
Dian's now the EIC of the American Prospect, but he was at the Baffler and many other places, the Intercept and so on, for a long time. He's very good on this.
Excellent. All right. We have a little reading list now. Um, all right. So, a couple of audience questions here. And of course, if anyone has some last minute additions, get them in there. But here's one for you, Cory. And you were somewhat getting to this just a moment ago. But aside from bottom up efforts, such as talking to friends and asking them to talk to their friends, what systemic effort can a technically minded person make to help deconstruct the status quo and make room for more decentralized communities?
Yeah, so Lawrence Lessig, 20 some years ago, wrote about the four forces that act on our society. So there's code, things that are technologically possible. There's law, things that are lawful. There's markets, things that are profitable. And there's norms, things that are socially acceptable. They all relate to one another, right? Things that are socially unacceptable are harder to make profitable. Even if there's a high margin for them, nobody wants to do them because they're socially unacceptable. That's why making smoking socially unacceptable made smoking less profitable. Um, but if you think about yourself as trying to do this hill climbing exercise, trying to ascend the gradient towards the better future that we all want, you can think about those as the four cardinal directions, right? Is there, that I don't want to make it sound like I'm a consumerist here, right? Like you should just buy things from the right companies. But is there a specific commercial intervention? Is there a thing that you can buy, or a way that you can switch your consumption habits that will make a difference to make it easier to, say, pass a law? Or is there a law that you can write to your lawmaker about that will make it easier to start a business that actually challenges Facebook? Or is there a free and open source software project that if you're a coder, you can contribute to? Or if you're someone who's multilingual, you can contribute to by localizing in another language. Or if you're someone who has specialized needs, you can evaluate for them through the lens of someone with low vision like me, or with other disabilities, or specific needs or use cases that they may have left off. So, norms, talking to your friends is really important, right? Things that are like socially acceptable happen. Things that are socially unacceptable happen a lot less, and don't underestimate the value of talking to your friends. Remember, Obama took office promising that he would never enact same-sex marriage equality. conversations among friends, right? The social unacceptability of having that position and the shifting norm made the law change, right? And so talking to your friends is important, but so is getting involved in organizations that lobby. You know, we had a really high profile California legal battle over Proposition 22 that we lost, and that is going to redound for years, if not decades. And it's going to really hold back the effort. So next time there's a Prop 22, ring doorbells for it. You know, join a phone bank for it, right? Do the law part, but don't get stuck in any one of those domains, because all of us can act in at least two of those domains, right? You don't have to be a coder or an entrepreneur. You can always act in the law domain, and we can always act in the norm domain, and we often can intervene in the tech and the law domains. And if you can or the tech and the market domains, and if you find that you don't know what to do in the domain that you're in, it may be that you've reached a dead end in that direction, and you need to pick another direction and find a way to ascend the gradient using that tool.
Thank you. Okay, here's another. When it comes to the relationship between the government and tech, regulation, restriction, etc., are there any countries that you think are getting it just right?
No one's getting it just right, but the direction of travel in a lot of places is good, and often for weird reasons, right? You know, you have the European Union creating the first regional strong privacy law, the GDPR, that had a private right of action. Private rights of action are really important. A private right of action means that if your privacy is violated, you don't have to convince a district attorney or a federal prosecutor to take your case. You can bring an action. Private rights of action are really important because they change the calculus, they allow class actions and so on. And so the European Union did that. And GDPR is a mixed bag. There's plenty in there that's not great. But a private right of action and a strong privacy rule was probably brought into the European Union because there's a great appetite to punish American firms more generally. And so because it ended up, they thought they were going to punish Google and Facebook, they were willing to bring it in. As it turns out, you know, small ad tech companies tend to be worse because they're not playing an iterated game. Like either they're profitable soon, or they're out of business in a couple of months when they run out of money. And so they tend to be the worst actors. And so all the small European companies went bust when they passed it. But nevertheless, we got this great privacy law, or these great elements of a privacy law. And since then, they followed up. The Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, the DSA and the DMA, are really good. India's antitrust action is pretty good, and the work that India did blocking Facebook from doing its subsidized mobile network, where you would get Facebook for free over mobile, but it would cost money to access all of Facebook's competitors. That was pretty important. But there is no one country that's got it right. Everyone's kind of feeling their way along.
The flip side of creating spaces that get it right when Facebook gets it wrong is the existence of a bunch of spaces that get it much more wrong than, say, Facebook. Is that just the trade-off we have to accept and learn to live with?
Yeah, so there is definitely a trade-off here. You know, there's a theory of change that says there are people uttering speech out there that, while it is unlawful, it is nevertheless awful, right? So, you know, you're allowed to be a racist. You just shouldn't be. In the US and in many other places, it's not illegal to be a racist. Certain forms of racist harassment are illegal, but racism itself is merely odious. And there's a theory of change that says maybe what we could do is aggregate all of our speech forums so that they are under the domain of a couple of wise kings. And then we could ask the wise kings to ban racism. And they haven't been very good at that. And they're not going to be able to do it. Like, they have a problem with scale. They also have a problem with like understanding the issue. And then they have a problem with automation. You know, if you try to imagine an algorithm that can distinguish between the "shut up, you racial epithet," and then he said, "Shut up, you racial epithet," and the senator was not reelected when it emerged that he had said, "Shut up, you racial epithet," those are three very different. Sorry, someone's just turned on my car horn. I guess it was my wife. Those are three very different possible three very different forms of speech. Only one of them is arguably only one of them is racist, maybe two, but certainly not the third one, right? Not the thing where the person who has been victimized or traumatized by racism discusses it with other people. And so an algorithm that can distinguish between those three is like not only doesn't exist, but there's nothing that looks like it on anyone's drawing board. And so there's always going to be problems with nominating a wise king to eliminate lawful but odious speech. Um, if, on the other hand, we can pluralize our speech forums and federate them so that you can find people whose speech norms suit you and talk to other people whose speech norms differ from yours, but also decide to break your community from theirs and make them non-compatible when you find that the distance between you is too far altogether. You know, like I think that it should be fine for sex workers to talk among themselves, and I support that, and I think it's great. I don't want that community federated, or at least those forums federated with my daughter's middle school. Not because I feel judgmental about it, but because I think that they're like an inappropriate merged conversation space. So if you can imagine that there'd be lots of conversation spaces, the ones that had compatible but differing norms could merge, the ones that didn't could either unilaterally or bilaterally separate themselves, and that this could produce a world in which the salience of bad speech that was lawful was less important to you because you could still be part of a global conversation. You could still, you know, my friend Cecil Castellucci is a woman comics artist who, you know, was writing was writing Batgirl for a while and so on. And she gets trolled by horrible dudes because she's a woman who makes comics. And so they will send her a DM that's really revolting, and then they'll delete it after they see she's read it. Twitter won't let you submit a screenshot because they're too easy to fake, so they get to hang out on Twitter. And then they send her public timeline messages that reference this now deleted message that are on their own fine, but when seen in light of this other message are re-traumatizing. And you could imagine that Cecil and the like disappointingly small number of women who also write comics could have their own corner of our federated social media space where they could still get the professional and personal benefits that they get out of being on Twitter because they could talk to everyone who was part of that federation, but they would not be subjected to the judgments of Twitter about whose conduct was too odious to allow them to stay in that social space. And so, you know, that kind of large federated interoperable world does continue to allow bad speech, not necessarily unlawful speech. I actually think snuffing out unlawful speech is easier in those communities. First of all, because most unlawful speech is speech that there's a wide consensus we don't want to see, child sex abuse images and so on. But also because smaller communities are less powerful. And so they're easy to enforce against, right? Facebook is very hard to enforce against. You know, Parliament summoned Mark Zuckerberg to testify, and Zuckerberg said no, right? I mean, the mother of all parliaments, the British Parliament, couldn't get him to show up and talk to them. You know, that's not going to be the case if you run a federated instance with 10,000 users. You're not going to have the clout to tell Parliament to get stuffed.
Right. Um, let's do one more very quick question, and then I am going to have to draw the conversation to a close, although I could talk to you forever, it seems. So interesting. And thank you again for all of this time. So, one last question here. Do you think public platforms like Wikipedia or Mediawiki are a solution to keeping web content open, factually accurate, and accountable?
I mean, they're part of the solution. I'm a big fan of them. I donate to Wikimedia every year and have done for more than a decade. Um, they are incomplete and they have problems. You know, the participation barriers have gotten very high, uh, as has been lamented by Wikipedians themselves. There also is a great deal of homogeneity, and then there's a risk of being gamed. Right, their openness makes them liable to being gamed. Uh, but the thing that I like about Wikimedia is the same thing I like about the Internet Archive, which is that it's part of what we can call like a public interest internet, right? Not just a nonprofit internet, but major services online that exist to serve, like explicitly to serve the public interest, and not any one parochial interest, and not to enrich any one person. They're really there because they have a vision of a digital realm whose goal, which they may not always meet, is to make the public sphere stronger. And I really like that. I think that was very much the spirit of the early internet. It was where, volunteer BBSs and Usenet feeds that were carried on people's personal computers, and early websites that were made just to find the people who like the same stuff as you and build little communities with them. That's where we started, and that's why we got excited. And I don't think we have to give up on it.
That is a lovely note for us to end on. Once again, Cory, thank you so much for your time. For the audience, if you haven't read it yet, How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism is available on Medium, and also now in a print edition that you can buy anywhere online. You can follow Cory on Pluralistic, and please do continue to follow Medium for updates on upcoming Medium in Conversation events. There's actually another one about the COVID vaccine and the future of vaccines that will be held with our VP of Editorial, Siobhan O'Connor, next week. So please check that out. Cory, this has been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
We should mention also that there's EPUBs and MOBIs.
Yes. Oh, that's right. Yes, there are. Right. And I believe the DRM situation has been straightened out.
There's no DRM on them. And if you want to buy, you can buy them at all the ebook stores, but also craphound.com/shop is my bookstore. And you can
there you go. Thank you. Check it out, everyone. And thank you for attending this event.
Thank you.